Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another very special, as always, episode of the Hyperconscious Podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, you will see that we have a little bit of a different setup. If you're just listening, we have a very special guest today. He is the host of the Humans 2.0 podcast. He is a LinkedIn master, a professional speaker, and a soon-to-be author. We are sitting down with the one and only Mark Metry. What is happening, brethren?
Dude, so we're coming in. It's 8 a.m. I'm doing a 48-hour fast right now. I feel pretty weird, but it's in a good way. And it's so great to be back here since last time we chatted in
September.
Yeah, or even before that in like March, April on this podcast. So
you seem to be in
crazy.
very, very good spirits. I definitely can sense a little bit of a difference in you, maybe because of the lack of food.
This time?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you fast, it's totally different because, like, I had previously did a 24-hour fast, like, last year, and you have, like, just way more energy. You have mental clarity. Like, your brain just goes into a different state of mind. Like, last night, literally all my brain was telling me is just, like, yo, go up and get this food. Like, just, I could just, like, feel, like, so much desire in, like, the raw, primitive human side that's a part of all of us.
Right.
And then when you see that, and, like, I haven't even hit 24 hours yet.
Right.
I'll hit that in, like, the next 34 hours. Then I have another 24 hours. So we'll see how it goes. But it's definitely a tool for sure. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Your tools have definitely helped Alan and I expand our repertoire of tools. I've tried to meditate more because of the things that we talked about. I've tried to eat healthy because of the things we talk about and the gut microbiome and all that happy jazz. But so you're writing a book.
Yes.
And it's called Screw Being Shy, and it's all about social anxiety. So I wanted, and I told you guys before this, my intention is to dive into social anxiety because I think a lot of people deal with that. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you ever have.
Not much.
Right? So I know a lot of the listeners do, though, because that's been a big thing. Remember, I helped Amy. She works on the team now. I went to the mall with her, and we walked up to people to start conversations because that was one of her biggest fears.
Strangers, yeah.
Yeah.
It's key.
So in your mind, 12-part question. In your mind, what is social anxiety? What are the concrete steps that you can take in order to expand your comfort around it? And do you have to create a reason? Like, is wanting to get over social anxiety enough, or do you have to have another reason? So, 3-part question.
So I'll just talk about it. So my book, Screw Being Shy, How to Eliminate Social Anxiety and Be Yourself in Front of Anyone, comes out March 14th.
Ooh.
Fire.
And, yeah, I mean, I just sort of, like, literally in September and October, I was like, I got to write this book because there's way too many people that used to be someone like me, and they're still stuck in sort of like their own bubble in this world where they can't talk to people, they can't say what they actually mean. There's many different varying degrees of social anxiety. I think everyone experiences it to some degree. So someone like Alan may not really experience it, but let's say, you know, he's in a crowded room with a ton of people that he doesn't know. You know, maybe, you know, he or someone else may feel a little bit shy, but it doesn't necessarily kill them. For me, growing up, it predominantly placed a ton of boundaries on my life. Like, I could never talk to people. I could never, you know, even people that I did like my family and my friends, I could never legitimately communicate with them. And so when you kind of take a step back, you have to realize that, you know, a lot of people talk about people being introverted, people being extroverted. A lot of people associate introversion with social anxiety. That's not necessarily the case. The definition of an introvert is someone who predominantly pays more attention to their internal world, to their thoughts, and they gain energy from that. An extrovert is the opposite of that. They're more focused on the outside world, and they gain energy from the outside world. Introversion and extroversion is something you're sort of born with. It's sort of a personality trait. For the most part, it's fixed. Social anxiety is usually developed. So, for example, a lot of people that I talk to, they will say, like, some specific moment in their life when they became socially anxious, when they became super shy. For me, it was a combination of moving around to a ton of different schools, having health issues that made me have no energy, and then also experiencing a decent amount of racism and bullying and things of that nature, all sort of combined into one, ended up looking back at it, I was like, wow, there was a clear line in the sand where I developed social anxiety. And for some people, there's obviously this misconception of like, if you are socially anxious, if you are shy, you might grow out of it, and that can definitely happen. But oftentimes, especially if you look at the data, that doesn't actually end up happening. Why this is so important is because these people that usually develop social anxiety, being shy as a kid, they grow up and they have adults. What is the key to having a happy life? Meaningful relationships. If you have social anxiety, you can't do that. So then you start moving into the area of like substance abuse, and you start going to parties or hanging out with people only when you can have a drink, or only when you vape something or smoke something, and then you become dependent, or you take a pill, or you take this or that. If you look at the correlation between people that have social anxiety and that kill themselves, like commit suicide, is extremely high. It's like, why is nobody else talking about this? And so I was kind of looking at this and I'm like, wow, maybe those people were like, whenever you hear like, hey, if you have suicidal thoughts, you should call, 1-800 this, or you should go to a therapist. What if those people can't even talk to people, let alone a professional? And so I view social anxiety, being shy, as like this meta issue that if we are able to provide the right framework, the right methodology behind it, and give it to anyone who experiences it, we can have way less, right? Because it's like, you see this everywhere. People that, do horrible things, whether it's kill themselves or they kill other people, there's often a period where they just don't talk to anybody because they're socially anxious, because they just don't know how to talk to people, or they've developed a fear of talking to people that, like in my book, I talk about it, is not just like telling somebody to talk to someone. It's something that is like a real trauma-based fear that their nervous system literally has a hold of, and they can't talk to people.
When somebody, so what, for you gave an example of what that like line in the sand of when you started to become socially anxious. What are some of the common ones that you hear from other people, so the listeners can think like, okay, maybe this happened here?
Yeah, so it's usually something happens in the family. Your parents split up and you have to move between their houses. You have to move different schools. You have to move different areas. Something happens in your friend group where a rumor goes around or gossip, and you get exiled within your friend group. There's just so many different kinds of scenarios. But usually it's like lack of stability, lack of a foundation.
Okay.
Some kind of conflict in the outside, whether it's your parents or your family, or you don't fit into situations. It could be like some kind of a health issue where you have to like leave school for like a year to go to the hospital or to be homeschooled, and then you come back and you're like, wait, what's even going on? I lost my skills. And so there's a lot, but generally speaking, it's one of those for sure.
When you said skills right there, you're referring to communication skills? What are you referring to? Lost my skills.
So usually it's like, you get into a habit of, so for example, for me, I was always an introverted kid, but I was never necessarily shy. I had friends, not a decent amount. I had kind of a tight-knit friend group, ended up switching around schools, kind of developed like social anxiety, kind of went into this bubble. And then what happens is, so for me, it happened around like 3rd, 4th grade.
Right.
As I got older, and as I was like in 9th, 10th, 11th grade, the situations that enabled me to be socially anxious were no longer present in my life anymore. There weren't people bullying me anymore.
Right.
I wasn't like the new kid anymore, whatever, but the effects of that were still there. And
Okay.
so those skills, if you even call them skills, that I had before of like talking to people and friends, because I hadn't used them, they were gone. So I wasn't utilizing them, and they just slipped away.
And
I
if
was
you don't
living in
use
my
it,
own
you
bubble.
lose it type of thing. Just like if you don't go to the gym, your muscles will
For
degrade.
sure,
So
and a lot of the times this stuff happens as a kid, so it's like these aren't even developed. Like,
Right.
you know what I mean, these things just kind of happen.
interesting.
I think so. As you were saying that, when I was 25, I moved to New Hampshire with my girlfriend. My girlfriend left me. I lived alone for 2 years, and there was days I didn't talk to anybody, literally a single person.
Yeah.
So I think that might have been like, because I don't remember being that bad before.
Well, dude, it's like the frog in the pot of boiling water.
Right.
Like your mind is the most powerful thing ever. We all agree with that.
Right.
Humans 2.0 hyperconscious, we're talking about the mind. That can be used for like chasing your dreams and connecting with the world, or it can be really detrimental.
Yeah.
Like, go ahead.
Sorry. So this is the biggest thing, right? So the very first chapter in my book is called "Social Anxiety is Actually Not Your Problem," and what it goes into talk about is that social anxiety is a problem. It is, some people could label it as a disorder for sure. Maybe I would too. But social anxiety is not like the main problem. Okay. And to give you guys an idea of this, the first time that I realized I was socially anxious was when I was at a party in college and I got drunk for the first time. And I was like, wait, all of a sudden I can talk to people now? And it was that moment of awareness. I was like, oh, wow, I'm actually pretty shy. I'm socially anxious. But as I sort of began to go on my journey deeper and began to backtrack and go back throughout my life, I realized that my main problem was not actually being super shy. That was the superficial,
The story.
shallow
Right.
story that I was telling to myself that I almost put on myself as a mask to just not deal with the world. So some people could do this with like the emotion of anger and rage, and they could be known as like that angry person, when in reality they're just putting a suit of armor on their ego because they got hurt once upon a time by their dad or whatever kind of situation. Like, that's never happening to me again, and they put on this mask to protect themselves from the world. And so for me, that was my mask. It was being socially anxious. And the more you dig into it, it's like at a very raw, real level, it's like I just didn't want to take responsibility for who I actually was in life. I didn't actually want to deal with the hard things based on, the lack of skills that I had and, my fears around the world. I was like, you know what? I'd rather not deal with this. I'm just going to check out, and I'm just going to be the shy kid, just not talk to anybody because I don't want this problem to happen to me again.
So there's so many things that I want to ask you. One of them, we've talked briefly, we mastermind basically weekly. We go to the gym, we go to Dunkin' Donuts, and we talk about life. Yeah. And like Kevin mentioned in the preamble, every single time we see you, you're like, oh my God, I learned this new crazy thing. So, which I love, by the way. If you're out there right now, get around people who every time you see them, they have this new thing to teach you. It's life-changing. And
Truth.
A lot of the stuff you guys are hearing right now, Kevin and I and Mark have talked about behind the scenes prior to this, because you've been writing your book now for what, like almost 6 months now?
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, on the top 5 regrets of the dying, a book Bronnie Ware, who we've had on the show, wrote. It's amazing, right? So I have a flashcard in my pocket with all 5 regrets because I want to reverse engineer regret. We talk about this on the podcast all the time. The 4th one is I wish I had the courage to express my true feelings, which I believe is the solution to social anxiety. What's your take on that?
So that's the 3rd chapter of my book. It's
Okay.
basically called Life's Greatest Invention. And it goes off this play that Steve Jobs talks about, basically where he says that death is life's greatest invention because it really enables you to just figure out, like, I have a limited time here on this planet. Do I really want to waste this time being being someone who doesn't express their feelings, doesn't have deep relationships? And I remember for me, the first time when I actually realized that, was in probably like a pretty dark time out of my life. It wasn't the only thing that led me there, but realizing that I was going to die and realizing that, and so if I could take a step back here. So chapter number 1 in my book is Social Anxiety is Not Your Problem. Number 2, it's called The Truth About Human Nature. And it dives into like, people's opinions, our society, the neurochemistry of our experience, the neurochemistry of other people's opinions, how we perceive other people's language, how we're able to talk about it. And it's basically like, if you are socially anxious, regardless of how you got there and regardless of how serious it is, you are essentially letting electricity that fires back and forth between your neurons of what you think other people's electricity firing between their neurons back and forth impact your life. And it's like when you're on your deathbed and you haven't talked to people don't even know who you are, you're going to be like, what the heck? And so, I'm so grateful that people like like you can be alive in today's world and read access to books and get this knowledge that people would normally naturally figure out on their deathbed. And if you can realize the end now,
Right.
you can change the end and you can remap it to what you're doing today to create a new end by the time you do die. And so it's so great. And like, firstly for me, like real quick, like if I die and my book is out, that's cool.
Right.
Obviously I don't want to die,
Right.
but it's like, I've created something that's now an extension of me that's going to live past my mortal, very fragile human life, and it's something that people can benefit from as long as the book's good, I hope. But it's it's so super critical to think about your death, and honestly, in any problem you have, not just social anxiety.
What were the beginning small steps for you? Again, like people could look at you now, and this is one of my favorite things about you. You talk about the things that people would look at you and say he could never have this, he could never be this, he could never have this limiting belief, and you're like, no, I just figured out this, and this. So earlier in your journey, when you were like, oh, I do have social anxiety, what were the initial steps? And more so, what else was the motivator? Did you literally look to the end and say, like, I don't want to regret dying? Like, what was your motivation?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a time in my life where I was, heavily flirting with suicide. It was probably like towards the end of 2015, beginning of 2016. And obviously, it's not like I just figured it out. But I had like a series of nights where basically what I would do is, so I lived up in Boston, and my apartment was like literally neighboring Dorchester.
I used to live in Dorchester.
Yeah.
Dorchester.
So you know how crazy Dorchester is. And I remember like when I was in college, we'd always get text messages on our phones that say, hey, down the street from you, there's like this shooting that's going on, because Dorchester is a crazy place. And so basically, sort of the pain of not being who I was got to me. And I was just like, I'm in so much pain. I need to end this. And so I basically came up with the idea of like, I have to just walk in like those terrible areas of Dorchester, and I would just like fantasize in the back of my head of just someone trying to kill me, and because I just didn't want this to go on. And so that happened for like a couple weeks, and eventually on one of those nights I kind of like began listening to podcasts, I remember listening to this podcast by Tim Ferriss, and he talked about how he was suicidal.
Right.
And I kind of saw
Powerful
him.
story.
Yeah, and I kind of saw him, and I was like, wait, he was like that, and I'm like that now, and
Right.
look at him, what he's doing today.
Where was he? He was in college, and he actually had a whole plan.
Yeah, he had a letter
Right.
written and all that stuff, and
Oh my God,
luckily some people helped him out of it. And I just sort of saw that story, and there were a few other factors. But yeah, so I was in that state, and I remember like I had like this crazy night. It was the last night where I began walking, where it was basically like, when I came to your house, like just now, we're outside, you said it's so silent here.
Mm.
And so I remember on one of those nights when I was walking, I wasn't listening to a podcast. I wasn't listening to anything. There were like no cars in the street. This was like 2 a.m. And all of a sudden I just like felt silence, like just zero sound whatsoever. And I felt like I heard that for like the first time in my life ever. And so when I heard that, I kind of felt or believed, I guess, in like my real voice, my real like intuition kind of speak up for this first time. And it's not like it was like an audible sound like, hey, go do this, do that. But when I heard that, I was able to realize that, there's something much deeper than like this black and white reality that we all experience, just that we look at through our eyes. Because that's the way I always viewed life. Like I was a very I tried my best to be a logical and analytical person. Like, I know what's best. If I don't see it in front of me, it doesn't exist. I know what's right, blah, 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 blah. And so when I experienced that, and I was like, wait, maybe I am actually wrong about something. And I kind of felt like this very, very deep, ephemeral part of me sort of be contacted in a way that I kind of felt like my souls were like, reconciled. And obviously when this was happening, I didn't figure this out.
Right.
But like I just kind of felt like deep emotion. I remember like literally running home, like crying in tears, and I don't even know what happened. I just kind of felt like this deep emotional, like this sense of hope that someone's like got my back. And I remember like that night when I came home, I like walked in my bathroom. There was like this, there was like a full mirror, like screen wall. I remember I walked in, and at this time I was like 220 pounds, but I didn't actually know I was overweight. And I remember I just like looked down, remember like kind of feeling my pants. Like I kind of felt like I was in the present moment for the first time in my life. So I could like kind of feel my pants and how they were like super tight. And I was like, wait, why are my pants like that? And I remember looking at myself through the mirror and being like, huh, that's pretty interesting. Like I've changed because I was never overweight throughout the years. And so it was like a combination of like a lot of these issues of like something's clearly wrong here. I see the physical representation of that. And that to me was sort of like the first step, because at that time, I didn't know what social anxiety was. I didn't know what mindset was. I didn't know what mental health was, any of this stuff. I wasn't conscious of 0% of the stuff.
Wow.
And so when I saw myself in the mirror, I was like, huh, that's an issue. Maybe I should look into that. And so I began to like read books on like health, nutrition, food, messed up a bit, found sort of like a right way to eat food, a right way to look at it through the lens of health. Lost all the weight in like a matter of a few months. But more importantly, I kind of felt like my brain turned on for the first time ever, because I was eating the right kinds of foods. I was eating the right kinds of dietary fat. I was eating the right kinds of vegetables. I had never done that throughout my entire life. I had just eating like a strict college-based diet, pizza,
Right.
you know, I don't know, bread, bagels. I would order takeout all the time. I'd eat Oreos on candy and all this stuff. And I had basically always eaten like that for my entire life. But when I started to eat healthy, I felt like I had energy in my mind and my body for the first time ever. And when I began to gain that energy, that gave me the opportunity, that gave me the space to actually begin to experiment these things that ended up sort of transforming me and becoming to who I was. And when I gained more energy, I was like, wow, I actually have enough energy now to begin to tackle this problem that I saw, social anxiety.
Right.
So it's like, as I was going throughout my journey, the first problem that I became conscious was of my weight, because I could see that physically through the mirror. And then it was like, oh, wow, I can't talk to people. I have social anxiety. And, you know, I basically began to realize that, like, wow, if I don't tackle this issue now, it's probably going to get worse. I'm probably going to be one of those dudes 10 years from now, and I was like 18, 19 at the time. I'm probably going to be one of those dudes 10 years from now that's like 29, 30, that can't talk to people, that just works some job that they don't really care for, doesn't have any deep, intimate relationships,
Right.
comes home, just watches TV until they knock out, probably drinks a ton, smokes whatever,
Right.
Eats a ton. And so I just sort of saw like these two paths in front of me of like, wow, I could keep going down this route of continuing to be socially anxious. Or, you know, then you reverse it and you think the opposite of like, what if I do tackle this? What if I do actually do what I want to do and watch, you know, what ends up happening? What is the best case scenario that could happen to me in 10 years? And I mean, it's been like, what, 4 years on my journey? And like, you know, already so many crazy things have happened to me in life that I would only dream of.
Right.
And so as that was happening, and as I gained more energy, and as I began to look into like other habits like meditation, writing things down, going to the gym, exercising, sleeping well,
Right.
all these things began to give me more energy, began to sort of give me presence over who I was. Meditation kind of like cracked me wide open, psychologically speaking, and it enabled me to really see who I was, and I was different than the identity that I had created
Right.
that was being socially anxious. And then I remember I would literally have days, because at that time I was living with a roommate of mine, and he ended up moving out because he transferred to some other school. And so I literally remember like this season of my life of like months where I literally just like sat in my dorm room, like literally alone, just like going to town on like self-development, just trying to find who I was. I like, you know, I was like, hey, how am I going to solve this problem of talking to people? I was like, yo, I'm just going to go out in the street and talk to random people.
Right.
And like at first I tried to do that, failed, couldn't even do it. I literally could not step outside and get myself to do it.
Talk about trapping, like being trapped.
Yeah, exactly.
Holy
So
crap.
I was like, hey, what if I, and I remember like writing this down on my journal. I still have this. It's so cool to look at now. And I was like, hey, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to talk to 2 people and I'm just going to ask them what time it is.
That was hard for you at one point.
Yeah. So
Now you're a speaker on stages with hundreds of people.
Yeah.
Like,
For sure.
anything is possible when you get your mind right.
Yeah,
It's
for sure.
unreal, dude.
Yeah, this didn't even happen that long ago. So I was literally like, hey, I would walk up to people like, hey, sorry to bother you. Do you know what the time is?
Sorry to bother you.
Yeah,
you
that's
apologize
literally- yeah,
first.
That's literally what I said, yeah. And they'd be like,
As
yeah.
if they're going to say, get the out
Yeah.
of here, you know?
I'm like, yeah, bro, you don't have a cell phone? It's like, it's 8:35.
yeah, right. It's 8:35.
Or whatever. And then once I did that like 5 times, I did that 10 times, and I'd say, hey, do you know the directions on how to get to like Dunkin' Donuts? And Dunkin' Donuts, like you could see it.
right.
So like I would work my way up to that, and then I would like say that to people, and then eventually I would like try to like slip into something that wasn't like as like, hey, do you know what the time is? I'd say, hey, that's a nice jacket, by the way, or like,
Right.
hey, I like your shoes.
Compliments?
Yeah, or like, hey, it's a great weather outside. Like just something out there, and then eventually I would just have conversations. I would just force myself to do it.
Was the reason why you're doing this, because that's fear chasing, which we just did an
exposure
episode.
therapy. Yeah.
Yeah, exposure therapy, right, which is another word for fear chasing, the correct term for it, really.
Right.
But like,
We need
why,
our term.
why were you doing that when you look back? Like, did you have a bigger reason? It was because of the. I mean, you mentioned in your story, like, I saw this one path that would make it worse and worse and worse, and then this one path to get better. Like, how did you know that would make it better?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I didn't. But here's the thing. So, like, I don't normally consider myself a shy, socially anxious person. For sure, I am naturally an introvert, zero doubts. But I
Right.
also have extroverted tendencies, too. But, like, here's the thing, man. I remember now looking back at it. I remember as a kid, as a teenager, I remember wanting to talk to people all throughout my entire life, but my
Right.
brain didn't let me. So, like, I was finally saying, like, wow, I'm actually going to do the things that I've always wanted to because I am so sick and tired of living this life. Because here's the thing, right? So a lot of people have social anxiety, but let's say they join the baseball team. And let's say they make like 2 or 3 friends on the baseball team, and that's who they hang out with. Eventually, you know, they might learn or they might party, they might, like, I don't know, without alcohol or whatever, they might develop social skills or like a little bit more, but they're still socially anxious, but they're using some sort of a crutch in a good and bad way.
Right.
I didn't have that at all. And so I literally lived my life for almost a decade of literally just not talking to people. And so I lived with a ton of like this pain that was just like being fueled into the background. And so when I got to a spot where I was 18 and I was like over 200 pounds, can't talk to people, didn't have any friends, was doing the stuff in my life that I did not want to do. And I was like, wow, I'm now living with the consequences of not living my life. And I've known that for the last decade. And so I kind of had like a ton of pain that was fueling me forward that I think gave me an extreme advantage over people
Right.
that didn't have that. That maybe, and again, my life is not terrible. I'm not trying to give that illusion. A lot of us have problems in different senses. But I felt like I just kind of got wrecked in just like a season of life when I was a kid that I was like, this is not happening again.
Right.
I've lived with these consequences. I'm like, this is just not happening. And so when I was going out there just trying to talk to people, I was like, I've always wanted to do this.
Right.
And it was always in the back of my mind. And then it just came down to how do I actually do that? And as someone who was working on the process of developing themselves, and I think I mentioned this in our last interview, but I remember when like I lost all the weight and I was looking healthy. I remember I looked at myself in the mirror. And I remember this was like the first day of like my sophomore year of college. I had like moved back, seeing all my friends. I had lost a ton of weight. I remember looking at myself in this mirror and I was just like, wow, I did this. I went from someone who was like this to now I'm like this.
Yeah.
That was the first time ever in my life that I realized that self-improvement, self-development was a thing. You could have an idea and then work on it, do it, and then see a change in the real world. So when I realized that, I was like, oh, snap, I could take this same idea, this same methodology, and put it into what I actually want to do. And so when you begin to like meditate and you begin to go into these things, you begin to see sort of like these layers. And I can get into it's like a whole other thing, but it kind of goes back to like ego and the different layers of our
Right.
existence of meditation because it's super important for me. It's up
Oh,
to you
yeah.
guys.
Well, yeah, I want to hammer that. I also have another question.
Yeah.
So after Alan and I went to Influencer Academy, Brendan Burchard's event, and I had this breakthrough when I got home. When somebody is wearing a tag and they're at an event to do the same thing you're at an event to do, I was talking to people in the bathroom. I was talking to everybody
Right.
and their mother. The second I saw somebody without a tag, it was like they're off limits. Why do you think?
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Because it's like you're assuming probably the people in the street don't want you to talk to them. But if you guys are at the same event, they'd want you to. Why?
Because the reason you're there is different. That's why you're in the room is more important.
So why are we afraid of going up to certain people and not other people?
Right.
Yeah, so this is the thing that I had to learn, man. So for me personally, whenever I learn something, whenever I'm trying to do something, I always look into the science behind it, right? Because I find that a lot of the time science today is sort of like the common language that everyone can understand that can explain a lot of the deeper things like our emotions, spirituality, things of that nature. Obviously not everything. And so in terms of like doing the research on this book and just finding out why people get socially anxious in the first place, it has to do with evolutionary biology. And so for me, when I was going to school out in Western Massachusetts and I was in like second, third grade.
What school did you go to again?
I lived in this town called Westminster.
Right.
Do you guys know where Westminster is?
Yeah.
So very small town, like 5,000 people.
Right.
Literally when I went there in school, there was maybe like 2 or 3 other families in that whole town that were not white. So literally everybody was like that. And so obviously I'm not white for people that are listening to this on audio.
Right.
But when I moved into that school and my brain looked around and it just saw white people that looked the same and I was different, that begins to put you in a really interesting place because this has never happened before in human history. Like immigration, of course it's happened like colonies and people have moved throughout, but it's never happened to this degree where you can, my parents came from Egypt a year or two before I was born. They flew here on a plane. They came over. This kind of widespread immigration diversity has literally never happened before in human history. And so you're talking about this brain organ, which is this metacomputer that has developed over hundreds of thousands of years to detect potential dangers and keep the main body, the main organism safe and survive.
Right. Different meant danger.
Different meant danger, right? And for good reason, right? Because if you're Native American or if you're a black person in Africa,
right?
If you see a ton of white people come over, oh shit, slavery's going down. You know what I mean?
Right.
Or this murder has happened. This is just human history. It is what it is.
Yeah.
So whether it is, our brain has evolved to just detect different as danger, or there's literally, trauma-based fears that go down into the cells of our DNA. Like, for example, they've done different studies that show, they've taken infants, human babies, and they've shown them pictures of snakes. And almost in every single case,
biochemical response.
Yeah, they see their heartbeat spike, and they're like, wow, hey, maybe snakes actually have a deep-rooted fear.
This is epigenetics.
In the human psyche.
Right.
And then maybe that's why, like, if you look at, teachings from way before us, like the Bible, for example, very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden, snake.
Right.
They've done other studies that show they take mice.
Apple, desire, snake. Fear.
Sure, that's a different thing. But they've done different studies like they take mice and they put them in a maze and they shock them at a specific part in the maze. So a mice goes up, it goes all the way to the right, it gets shocked.
I've heard of this.
Then they take that mice as kids.
Right.
They put that in that maze.
And they avoid it.
And there's no shocking in the maze.
Right.
So they won't go over that even because they want to. There's a ton of other anecdotal stories of, like, for example, one of, like, the leading trauma-based people, Maston Kipp, he was telling me that one of his clients, whenever she took a shower, she would see a ton of, like, red hives, a ton of red rashes on her skin. She went to all the doctors, all the specialists.
Right, and they said, you're fine.
Yeah, you're fine. They didn't know what happened. Turns out, like, her great-grandmother got killed in an acid shower in the Holocaust. And, like, that danger is stored in your cell. So I don't know what the case was for me, whether it was, I have an aversion to people that don't look like me or whatever the case is, but a lot of the stuff is evolutionary biology.
Right.
And so when I was beginning to learn about this stuff and you begin to go into it, it's like, wow, your brain would rather not talk in the case of, like, let's say there isn't even, like, let's say everyone looks the same. Let's say this is 1,000 years ago and you guys are all part of the same tribe. You guys are all part of the same village, okay? And back then, if you were isolated, if you were just like a human living in the woods, you would literally die in like 5 seconds. You'd be mauled to death by like a bear, by some other tribe. You'd get like raped, murdered.
Right.
That's what human history was. And so the only chance of survival that you had
Stay
was
together.
living in a group.
Right.
Okay. So even if everyone looks the same in your group, but you have this fear of like, hey, if I say the wrong thing to this village elder, if I say the wrong thing to an authority, then there's a chance that I could get kicked out, and that means death. And because our brain is super, super advanced in detecting threats, and we have a neocortex that can predict the future based on our past memories, your brain can develop the most extreme scenarios, and you could say like, hey, if I say the wrong thing, I could get ousted, and my entire family could get ousted with me. Now you're talking about your kids being murdered.
This isn't conscious, though. This is happening in the background.
This is not conscious.
How do we
This is
make it
happening in the
hyper-conscious? How do we make it humans 2.0? Because it's taking this stuff, understanding it enough to where now you can overcome it.
Yeah.
So how do people, like that moment when you heard that whisper when it was silent for the first time, and you started realizing like, oh, this is just my brain doing this to me, but now I can fix that.
Yeah.
How do we get people there if they haven't had the suicidal moment that Kevin's had
The hell
or the
no.
car accident that I've had?
The hell
right.
no. You went all the way to like, well, if
Rock
I died,
bottom.
I died.
Yeah.
Rock
And
bottom.
it's like
Right.
you have
Right,
to
rock
change
bottom.
Right.
something. Most people get to like pretty miserable, and then it's like it's so much pain for me to go get over these fears.
Yeah. So
And then they just Band-Aid it instead of getting to hell no.
Band-Aid,
Right.
Yeah. So I honestly, I think there's two ways to go about it. So I think one way is kind of like through like an experience that you don't necessarily choose, right? So a car accident, suicide, things like that. But I will say that I think I've avoided a lot of other problems in my life because I have been on this path of self-development. And so obviously what I would say is read my book for sure. But I mean, if you want the option, like what I would say is this. So I think it's all about facing pain and then not band-aiding it. So I think the biggest thing, and and like the way that my book works is like, there's a chapter and then there's exercises that you do. And like, it's designed to stop reading and to actually do stuff.
Right.
And one of the exercises is stop any vice that you participate in for 24, 48 hours.
Can you define vice for our listeners? Because I talk about this all the time.
Yeah, so a vice is something that, personally for me, is something that you go into that is an escape.
Right.
That relieves you of your responsibilities of who you are for a temporary period.
Fire.
So that could be you binge watching Netflix and living in another character on the screen's life for 3-4 hours.
Right.
That could be you
In a video game.
that could be you in a video game.
Right.
That could be you and pornography. That could be you and more direct with like drugs, alcohol, substances outside of yourself.
Right.
It could be, I think the biggest one is probably food.
Can we all acknowledge our biggest vice right now? Mine was alcohol.
Mine was
that was my
porn,
yours
porn
was-
and weed.
right. And what
porn
was
and weed.
yours?
If
If you're willing.
yeah, no, I mean, I've had so many. I think it goes from time to time. I think the biggest one for me, for sure, was food.
I want just the listeners to know you're not alone if you have a vice.
Yeah.
Mine was booze for
Right.
sure. And it's something that you're avoiding the truth of who you really are.
Yeah, and the thing is like, a lot of people, so like this is what I learned is like, when I was growing up, I didn't think I had any vices. And I looked at people that either drank a ton of alcohol and were alcoholics or did drugs, or like, those people are doing all the vices. But it's like for me, never really grew up partying or like getting into drugs or anything like that. And so for me, in my head, it was always like, here is a black box of things that I should not be doing, which is drugs, alcohol, things like that are super, super hard. But then outside of this box are like
Right.
normal behaviors like food, TV, video games that are not necessarily that, based on society's eyes,
Right.
that bad. But it almost, for someone who has that same thinking of me, it almost gives you like a permission slip.
Exactly.
You just like do whatever it is you want as long as you're not doing these things,
Right.
right? And so I think it's super important to remove those. And it's like, I get this all the time of like people that message me, my friends that I talk to, just any kind of interaction, literally all the time now, especially because of who I am and online, of how people recognize me. And they're like, dude, I've been trying to read this book. I've been trying to get on this self-development thing. I've been trying to change this habit. I've been trying to make this business. I've been trying to do this. But yet they're still participating in the behaviors that kept their previous identity solid, which was mostly propped up by vices. So
Right.
it's like, for example, for me, when I reached my like rock bottom, my suicide, and I began to like rediscover this whole relationship that I had with food, I realized that like, you know, wow. And I'm realizing it again through like this fast. That
As
I
he's
did
on a
today.
fast. That's the fascinating thing. Right
Yeah.
now, you're overcoming what was once a vice.
Right?
For
But-
sure. And honestly, today for me, food is not really a vice for me.
Right.
For
You've become
me,
the master, not the slave
it's-
now.
There's almost zero temptation that I actively engage in, I guess. There's always going to be temptation.
Right.
For me, this is more for like spiritual reasons and getting in a different state of mind. And challenging myself and facing micro adversity.
My goodness.
Because honestly, it's like this. Like the big thing I learned is like any of these things that you do, whether it's like you pick up meditation, which I want to get into because I think it's super important, and you force yourself to sit down and do nothing for 15, 20 minutes a day, or you tell yourself, I'm not going to eat these foods that 99% of people in this world are eating, or I'm not going to do these drugs, or I'm not just going to go to the bar after with my friends, or I'm not just going to...
You're taking back control.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's like all these things, you're not just taking back control, but you're also challenging yourself, right?
Right.
And it's like, if I've learned anything, life is nothing but challenges.
Right.
But the way to win at life is to create and choose your
Right.
own challenges. Because if you don't, life is gonna boom, boom, destroy you. And like, ever since like that moment for me of hitting rock bottom and then transforming my life around, past that moment, there have been so many adversities, so many troubles that have hit me in my life where I'm like, wow, if I was not on this journey, I probably would have killed myself because the problems that I faced were way worse than I was facing back then. So it's like being in that phase where you are continuously challenging yourself, whether it's through, you know, a physical modality, whether it's through going to the gym or fasting or you know, meditation or doing stuff that sucks for a temporary period, but it gives you that long-term period of discovery of to who you actually are. And like for me, I don't ever want to like be in a rock bottom. I don't ever want to be in a terrible position that I am in now. That's why I'm doing everything that I can now.
Do you ever think you will be? Somebody asked
For
me
sure.
that one time when I talked about suicide. She asked me, Joyce asked me this.
Right.
Do you ever think you debate suicide again? And I was like, every time I talk about suicide, people are like, oh, that's so awesome you made it out of that. Nobody's ever asked me that. And I thought to myself, like, I don't think so. Same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, ever since that happened, I've like literally never had like a glimmer of a thought that says like, yo, you should kill yourself. Or like, oh, this would be better if it just ended. Like, it's never happened to me ever since that moment.
Can I ask why do you believe that is?
Why do I believe
Because
it's
now
never
you're
happened?
challenging yourself. Like, yeah, why do you think you've never even had a glimmer? At one point, you wanted to die.
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure, 100%.
Let's wrap our heads around that for a second.
Yeah.
Now now you don't want to die.
Right.
What made the biggest difference?
Because I'm just a completely different person. I'm living a different life.
Now you enjoy your life. Now you like your life.
Now I thoroughly enjoy my life, and it's just like, this is what it is, right? So, going back to when I was a kid, okay, I experienced adversity from the outside. That created adversity from the inside. Then this inside adversity created issues and problems from the outside because I wasn't controlling my life.
Victim.
I learned that, and then now you do the opposite.
Right.
Now it's like, hey, I'm going to not deal with that anymore. I'm going to raise my standards. I'm going to move towards the path of growth. And then what happens is you slowly but surely start to become successful on the inside. You start to clean up your thoughts. You start to clean up your, you know, for me, I talk a lot about biochemistry because I think it's super important and it's really lacking in the self-development world. You begin to do these sorts of things. Now what begins to happen is the opposite. now you begin to create success on the outside. So a lot of people that get started in like this whole self-development world that may be at rock bottom or may not be at rock bottom, but they want to do better, they want to change, they start to become successful in here, but they either don't stick it out long enough, don't learn from the right people, get caught up in their own ego. They think they know everything and they're not beginners anymore and they're not learners. And what happens is they don't actually get anywhere on the outside, and they're stuck between
Because the outside's lagging.
yeah, and
Right.
they're stuck between this incongruent world.
Right.
And so what begins to happen is like, hey, you know, that internal world then begins to not be as great because everything's a feedback loop, right?
Exactly.
And like there's only a certain period of like, if you've been at this for 10 years and your life still sucks on the outside, you can't
Right.
you can't pay your bills, your mom still hates you, like just a ton of things like that.
Right.
Then your brain is gonna be like, bro, come on, man, you can't fool yourself. And then what begins
Right.
to happen is you're like, but hey, when I smoke this or when I drink this,
I feel good
I get the feeling
temporarily.
of
Right.
feeling high, and that begins to lead people down like a downward cycle. And what's even worse is when the outside world begins to tell you that you're successful, whether it's, you know, let's say you do have the money. Let's say you do have the kind of professional success. Like, let's say you're like, you know, we've known, not personally, but we've known actors
Oh yeah.
that are like at the top of their game. Everyone knows them. They kill themselves, or they're rappers, or they're artists.
Right.
And it's like that begins to happen. It's pretty interesting, right? So I'm watching this over the weekend. I was watching this this documentary on Netflix with my family, the Aaron Hernandez documentary.
I didn't watch it yet.
Yeah, so you basically begin to see like this totally normal dude, or even the Joker. Have you guys seen the Joker?
No.
I saw the Joker. Holy crap! You guys have all got to watch. I think the Joker is doing more in terms of the mission of mental health than like this entire industry combined.
Really?
Yeah. And
Wow.
literally what it shows is like everyone knows the Joker. You know him as some crazy dude with green hair, literally murders people, like literally the biggest psychopath ever.
Right.
You watch this movie, you see how this normal guy goes from beginning to just like having a job, trying his best, taking care of his mother. He takes a left turn, life hits him with a right turn, left turn, right turn, and you literally see the progression of a relatively normal guy go to complete batshit
Insanity.
serial killer.
Right.
Mm.
So you begin to see that, and it's like
Joaquin Phoenix played the
Yeah.
character. He did
yeah,
it? Okay.
Interesting.
Interesting.
It's insane. And so it's like, and so anyway, so back to the point that I was talking about of like, the reason why that doesn't happen to me now, the reason why I don't get suicidal thoughts now is because I have become, again, I still suck at a lot of things. I have problems, yada, yada, yada. But I've become successful on the inside, and now I'm beginning to see it on the outside. And that plays a feedback loop. And when I'm in that, there's a part of me that almost like doesn't even feel like what it was like to be the person I used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
I know.
I understand. Yeah.
For me, it's fitness that saved my life. That was proving to myself that I could overcome. Fitness became more valuable to me than alcohol. So I think what's interesting is you have to find something you care about more than the vice.
Right.
Dude, Martin Luther King Day was yesterday. He has this great quote that says something along the lines of, darkness cannot cast out darkness. You have to use the light to cast out darkness.
Right.
And essentially what he's saying is like two negatives, or you focusing on the negative will never produce a positive. So like I've literally stumbled into this 1,000 times, and I think I still am with like the different habits and vices that I still have today. But it's like I'll focus on, you know, I'll become conscious of something that I'm doing that's not great based on the information that I know. And then I'm like, okay, I need to not do this. I
Can
need
you
to
give an
stop doing
example,
this.
please, for the listeners?
Sure. So, like, for example, big one that I've had is different things with, like, my sexuality when it comes to things like pornography or acting too sexually impulsive with other people and things.
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, learn about the science of why it's not so great, learn about the
Right.
other implications of it. And then I was like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this.
Oh, yeah.
Happen.
And then you do.
Happen.
Yeah, it happens. It's like,
Happen.
damn.
And then you begin to look into like human psychology, and you're like, oh wow, that's just not the way the human brain works. You need to find a higher value
Right.
Right.
Why power?
on top of yourself.
Right.
Right. And then, you know, you begin to look into other things like being engaged with other behaviors that can give you connectivity,
Mhm.
being in a meaningful relationship. You look into things like that. and then this stuff just becomes
You don't
stupid.
need it anymore.
We
It's
got
not.
to talk meditation. So we got like 10 minutes. This is flying by.
Okay.
But I want to
Jesus
talk
Christ.
about meditation because that's every time I say, Mark, have you been foam rolling? He's like, yes or no. And he's like, Kev, have you been meditating?
That's an
yes
excuse, bro.
or no.
Right.
But
an
same
excuse.
for me. Same for me.
Yeah.
Why is meditation so important? What have you experienced from it, and how has your life changed because of it? And why should people do it if they want, the benefits?
Yeah. So
Sell us on it.
So this is what I think. So I think people should do whatever they want. I think I don't really like selling people on behaviors, but I also think that meditation is something that everyone should do. Even Gary Vee or whoever says that they don't need to meditate. So I remember I found meditation the last day of October on Halloween in 2016.
Okay.
And I remember I found it because I was just like, as I was reading books, as I was like just learning more, I kept on stumbling on like super successful people that meditate, people that I already knew that were like household names that meditated. And so it was sort of like in the back of my mind, but I also had a lot of hesitation, a lot of skeptical about it. I was like, again, at that time I was still very like,
this is the way.
logically, analytically minded. And
Well,
I
you
was
can't
like,
see it.
It's my biggest weakness right there.
Exactly.
Hands down.
And so I was sort of still stuck in that world and was like, dude, I don't want to be some kind of hippie who just like goes on top of a mountain and just sits there.
That's for Buddha, but it's not for me.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything. And that's just like an excuse to waste time. I'm a hustler, this, and that.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was sort of operating from that, but then I was basically like, I was going to Six Flags with my friends. It was like a part of my school trip. And so we were on like this 1.5-hour bus ride. And I was sitting next to my friend, but he was someone I lived with. I was like, I don't really want to talk to him. So I literally just like remember like being on the app store on my phone and then finding Headspace, the meditation app, which is like the #1 meditation app now, I'm pretty sure. Downloaded it, ran through like their 10-15 minute beginning tutorial, closed my eyes, did it, ended up opening my eyes and I mean nothing crazy happened, but I kind of had the feeling that like something was a little bit different.
Right.
And I remember it was like me going there with a group of my friends, and then we were also going to link up with a buddy of mine's group of friends at the park that I didn't know yet. There were like 3-4 people. And so I remember like going throughout that park. I don't know what it was. It could have been the meditation. It could have been my adrenaline was already high because of the roller coasters and stuff that I was riding. But I remember I began talking to those people that I didn't necessarily know, and I would never, ever do that. I'd never talk to people that I didn't know. Even if I was like directly introduced, I would just like not talk to them. I would say like at the corner of the group or something and just talk to people that I already knew. And so that was like one little small indicator. I was like, there's something that maybe I should explore into. And then after that, when I came back, every morning, I would just meditate. I think it was like anywhere from like 10-15 minutes. And I would do that for like a week, 2 weeks. And I remember around like the 1.5 weeks, 2 weeks mark, I basically, it felt like my life was collapsing in a bad way. It felt like I had so many issues. I had so many problems going on. And looking back at that today, what this is actually something that's known in meditation. I've talked about this with like some of the top meditation experts.
Is this the layers thing that you were talking about?
Yeah, they begin to shed. This is essentially what happens is like, this is the moment in the movie where the main character has been living their life in a certain way, and they finally face a problem
that they
And
were avoiding.
then they become conscious,
right?
And then they backtrack all their life, and they're like, "Oh my God, it was like this whole time." And they're like running, and then like the very background of life is changing. That's what began to happen. So like the things that I was leaning on the most in terms of my psychosocial identity, those things began collapsing in front of my head, because what begins to happen is when you meditate, literally all you do is you shut off the external environment. Literally all you do is close your eyes and you focus on your internal world, your breath. And if you've never done that before, because you're always, caught up, or you're on your phone, or you're in the feedback loop, you never get to a moment where you are just hearing your voice. And if you are in that moment, you begin to realize that like, oh wait, my brain is actually telling me things that are not my voice. So what begins to happen is, as you, obviously not the first time or the second or the third time, but as you sit down and begin to do this, you begin to recognize other voices that your brain has picked up as a survival mechanism to tell you to do things. It's like when you were growing up and your mom always told you, like, hey, make sure, I don't know, the dishes are always clean when I come home. And so you build a habit of like always washing your dishes, always making sure that they're clean as soon as possible. It's like that similar way. So your brain will pick up voices of things that it's heard from your past. So for me, it was like, you're a shy kid, or it's like you're a loser, you're never going to amount to anything. And you pick those up as your own voice. And now you have your own brain telling you that past the situation that's already happened and may or may not never happen again. Or you may experience that again because it's happening in here. And so when you meditate, you begin to realize that. And you begin to go from this sort of realm of like shallowly seeing your thoughts, seeing knowledge, and then beginning to actually understand them and beginning to consciously feel them. It begins to bridge the gap. And so when I was experiencing this, it was like you don't even know who you are anymore. Like I didn't even know who I was after I meditated. I almost had like people call it like an ego dissolving experience where like
you're simulating rock bottom, right? I mean, isn't that what it is? Because you think about the movie, and it's like right when the character is at their lowest point, and then all of a sudden you see the montage of them like cleaning their bed and cleaning their room and like eating healthy and like going them on the treadmill, right? And they skip through that part, which bothers me because the narrative bias of like that was 30 seconds when it was actually a couple years.
Now they're at the title fight.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then now they're about to win. So you're simulating a rock bottom moment.
I don't think you are. You're simulating
rock bottom
silence.
had to happen. Yeah, you had to. But basically, what you're doing is you're shutting. Like,
but at rock bottom, you have to acknowledge the truth. It strips away those layers.
You do, but I think when you're meditating, you hear the subconscious instead of all the external.
For sure. So I think both of them can happen for sure, and like that's why I recommend people that that's why I recommend everyone meditates. Because,
I think that's why you feel like you'll never hit rock bottom again. I think.
Dude, so there's
this is a
quote,
distinction.
There's this quote by Sam Harris, and it says, meditation is a simulation of what could be the worst day of your life.
So yeah, maybe that is. For me, it's
because
not
when you're
what
in
I
deep
think of.
emotional pain, you're everything's quiet. Like that silent moment when there was just you finally heard the whisper. That's what meditation is simulating, but consistently before it gets too bad.
100%.
See, for me, my darkest time was loud. My most painful
but
time
then it was quiet after that.
No. When I wanted to kill myself, I had 10 TVs playing in my mind at the same time. I wanted to turn the noise off.
How did you turn the noise off?
I texted you.
And then did it get quiet?
I went to work, man. No, there wasn't for me, it wasn't like that. For me,
everyone's different.
Yeah, when I get overwhelmed and I meditate, it's like, it's still loud and it's me sifting through like, let this go. And after I get this high of like, it feels like I came out of something and it's like
the present moment.
Whoa, yeah. And then I go about my day.
Because this is the thing, man. This is the other big part about meditation. This is why I still do it today. So now meditation is now sort of being sold or leveraged as like a high performance tool, a habit.
Right.
For sure it is. Everyone talks about like focus and things like that. But it's like the focus does not come from you sitting there and doing nothing and then all of a sudden doing something. The focus comes from you like throughout your normal day, especially if you're someone who has faced some kind of trauma, which is basically everyone. Right. You're not living in the present moment. You are living either, if you are someone who has a tendency to be more depressed, you are focusing on past events, on previous memories. If you have a tendency to be more anxious, you are trying to create the future in your head.
Right. And you're anticipating potential outcomes.
Exactly.
Right.
And so what begins to happen is you don't actually live your life, and so you're stuck in the matrix. And so the things that happen to you keep happening to you because you're not living in the right now.
Right.
And so what begins to happen is when you meditate and you begin to process these things that you've never processed before. I know for me, when you are in silence, and again, it takes a while. It's not like you do it for 2 weeks or even a month. Like I've been meditating for 1,000+ days now. When you begin to do that, you begin to understand like past events. Like I begin to like become conscious of like just thoughts and things that happened in my life that I just like threw in the back that I never consciously processed. That's like how trauma happens. You don't consciously process it. So then your nervous system is stuck in that moment trying to figure out what happened. But when you meditate, you are literally slowly relieving your psychological trauma of the past and of the future.
And therefore your reactions in the moment to feedback.
Exactly. And the reason, for example, why I was super depressed, this is what I found out. The reason why I was so depressed, the reason why I was at times suicidal, some of it for sure was anxiety and like, who am I going to be in the future? But for me, a big part of that was depression. I had never really been like seriously depressed before that time in my life. And what I realized was this: I was learning all these new things about life. I was beginning to get an idea of who I could be, but my past trauma was creating my identity, and it was telling me, hey, Mark, you could do this new thing, but that's not you. You're this person that is living in the past because I wasn't living in the present moment. And so you begin to either, whether it's rock bottom, you get in a moment of presence, or you go through meditation.
Deep emotions put you present too. I've noticed this, like a deep song that makes you cry. Have you ever cried and not been in the present moment? I'm convinced of this. I was like near tears last night just because this event is coming up. I think when you're crying, you're fully present.
Unless it's something that like you cry all the time and it's a habit for you.
Okay.
Like some people cry like every day, and it's like part of like their routine of like them getting upset about themselves and moping and being in a victim mindset. But for people like us, I'm usually always in the present moment because I usually cry.
For me,
I
that's
don't
the
think
case.
I am. I don't think I'm in the present moment that often.
Even
in this podcast,
when you cry,
I'm like thinking of everything. When I cry, no, it's not. It's not present. It's past or future. Usually, it's future. When I cry about Taryn, it's present and future.
But here's the thing, though. This is the thing. Every time that you are thinking of your past, that is a memory that is happening right now in your head. Right. Every time that you think about the future, that is a future projection happening now.
So is that still present?
In your head?
So you're not. So this is the thing, man. So this is what I've learned. Okay. So the average human has 60,000 thoughts a day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thoughts are something that are really interesting because you can't necessarily control a thought in the sense of once a thought has popped its head, you can't like take it back. Right, like when you sit here and you think, there is no pre-origination point of a thought. It's like the thought pops up, it comes in. But the real indicator of, I think, success or failure of present or not present is the way that your consciousness now tries to seduce you from that thought. So it's like thought pops up, boo, another thought pops up, boo, another thought pops up, boo. Depending on your emotions, depending on how you're feeling, depending on where you are in your life, your consciousness might take that thought, might be like, oh shit, that's right. Damn it, I'm never going to be able to do like this. And then it spirals you down to other thoughts and it recreates thoughts of anxiety. And so I think that it is entirely not necessarily about your thoughts, but the way that you believe them and the way that you literally feel them. And meditation can help you realize what's BS and what's not BS. So like, for example...
That's what hyperconsciousness is. Right. Interjecting between thought and action.
Yeah.
And acting on the ones that are true. Go ahead.
For sure. And like, what else puts you in the present moment? Drugs. Food.
That's what...
Right? Because it's like, sure, it sucks you up and it escapes you, but you are living in the present and you're addicted to that and you can feel those emotions and you can feel those feelings. But if someone does not live in the present moment, they're not living the life they want, they lie to themselves all the time, they're not living a life of truth, which is a major part of my book that not a lot of people talk about. If they're doing all those different things and they're not in the present moment, they can have sort of an artificial escape that can put them in the present moment for some temporary BS bubble time. And what begins to happen is, because they're not living in the present moment, because they're not in touch with who they actually are, the next time something awesome happens in their life, they don't feel it. They're desensitized. And same with vice versa of something bad happening, because they're not actually living their life. But the moment that you get in the present moment, you stop lying to yourself, you actually start living in the truth of who you are, is the moment where you can actually motivate yourself and you can actually live a life that is true to you. So it's like all this stuff is connected. I talk about all this stuff in my book.
And you think meditation is the way to get there?
It's one of the ways to get there for sure.
Do you think it's the most important? If for our listeners, if they want to live in the truth, what's the one thing they should do daily?
So I made a post about this. I said, if some random person comes up to me, I mean, okay, it's so hard, but if some random person comes up to me and they say, Mark, what can I do to help myself like get better at everything? I would say eat healthy or meditate.
Fire. Well, Mark Metry said it.
Mark Metry has said
It's
it.
good enough. He said it. It's good enough for me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? All right, so we already went over. We got to get out of here. But I want you to plug the podcast,
Yes.
tell people about the book.
Yeah.
Plug
So the
all that
book-
stuff.
Yeah. So if you go to my website, Mark Metry, MarkMetry, and you put in your email on like the little email address pop-up thing, it will tell you when the book comes out. It'll notify you to your email. You're not signing up to a newsletter, none of that. I'm releasing the digital version of this book completely for free, and I'm taking 10% of the profits of the physical copy of the book and donating them to the American Foundation of Suicide. The first few chapters of the book are primarily conceptually speaking, but also have actions of exercises that you could take. And the rest of the book is literally just like, here's how you do X, here's how you do Y, here's how you do Z. And when I looked around here, and I have many friends of mine that are psychologists, that are behavioral analysts, that are therapists, that are this, and that. A lot of people have written books on social anxiety and things along this nature. There's a lot of great books out there on it, but I have yet to find a book that has gone through a super practical journey that I have been on, that I have seen work for me, that I have seen work for a ton of other people, that is not just like based on like my thoughts and my stories and my anecdotes. Like there's over 150 scientific references in the book from peer-reviewed clinical studies, because I want to basically make this book like a game changer in the way that our society thinks about social anxiety, people being shy, introversion even, and how to get out of that. Because after doing the research and after actually seeing it, I view a ton of issues, whether it's addiction, suicide, mass shootings, terrible things happen. I view the meta issue as social anxiety, because when you can't talk to people, you can't ask for help. That is like the worst thing. And of course, there's a lot of other problems that someone can have for sure. But I think social anxiety is one of the worst, because it is a meta problem that stops you in so many other areas of your life. So I was just like, book doesn't exist. I got to write it. 6 months later, you have a book. So
It's awesome, man.
And it will. We already know, like, it's gonna crush it for sure.
Right.
You got 2 copies sold here. If they
For
could be
sure.
autographed, we'd
For
appreciate
sure.
two
that.
copies sold here. I'm going all out. If anyone has a podcast, anyone has an immediate thing, feel free to reach out to me.
We love it.
Absolutely. So if you want to change the rotten fruit, you got to find the root. I feel like you've found the root to a lot of problems in the world. Thank you so much for coming on the show. The other thing I want to say, Top Notch
It's
Live.
gonna be
Oh, it's going to be after. Top Notch Live went awesome. Mark Metry was one of the speakers.
What about the March
Oh, right. So it's actually going to
Yes.
be April. So it's going to be in April.
April?
April 25th will be the next Hyper Conscious Live event.
Hyperconscious Live. Mark has already said he's gonna be there.
Right.
We are gonna.
We got to double check the calendar since he thought it was in March.
Yeah, right. But we'll figure that out. But yeah. So we'll just say Top Notch Live 2020 went well. Mark is speaking at that event. So
Yeah.
I love everyone. Thank you guys for having me.
we appreciate you, my man. All right, everybody, check out Humans 2.0. Screw being shy when it comes out. Mark Metry is our boy, and he is changing the world one podcast, one book, and one day at a time.
Thank you so much
One
for coming on.
moment at a time, bro.
Adios.
Talk soon.